Hi, this is Ashish from developerhut.net and welcome to the next section of SOAP-based web services, which is how to consume the SOAP-based web services in a Spring Boot application. So in our earlier session, we saw how to create the SOAP-based web services, and we also created a very simple calculator web service in our earlier session. So if you don't know how to create the simple SOAP-based web services, you can find the link in this description section below. You can go through that tutorial and then you can come back to this tutorial. Now, in this tutorial, we are going to create a very simple client which will consume this calculator based web service. And we will see how we can easily create the client for this and how we can call the SOAP based web services method very easily. So let's go ahead and creating the client for this SOAP based web service. Okay, so let's start with creating the project. So I have created a simple Maven project with Spring Boot version 3.4.0. Group ID is com.developerhut.into the Spring and artifact ID is Spring Consume SOAP Web Service. The Java version is 17 and packaging type will be of Java. So we'll only require one dependency, which is Spring Web Services, and we will not be going to use any Tomcat or a web project as of now. So we will be executing this project via command line run. So let's go ahead and create the project. So I have imported the project. Now let's go ahead and update a pom.xml a little bit. The first thing is we are going to execute this web service via command line run. So we don't require the Tomcat as of now. So we will simply exclude the Tomcat over here. To exclude the Tomcat, you just need to add the exclusion tag in the dependencies section of the Spring Boot Starter web services, right? The next is we need to add the plugin so that we can create the required stub for the client, right? So for that, you simply need to add the plugin, which is Jax WS Maven plugin. I will simply copy it and I will paste it over here. So this is the plugin which we need to add, which is Jax WS Maven plugin, right? So this plugin will basically create all the required request and response related classes which we require to execute a call to our soap based website. So just make sure that whatever the package name that you are giving in the package name tag, that should be a correct one. And your WSDL URL has to be correct, right? Plus this should be accessible. So let's save this. So basically whenever this plugin is going to create the classes into this package, we required our soap based web service is running at that time, right? So let's go ahead and start our web services first. So I have started web services, right? And let's go ahead and let's refresh this project and let's see if our classes are created or not. So you just need to simply install your project. So simply go to run as and click on a Maven install. This will create all the required stub classes in target generated sources here, right? I will simply just refresh this and let's see if it works. I will go here and let's go to the target. And yeah, so if you see generated sources and WS import, right? Here you can find it out the package which you have given in your plugin section, right? So here com developer hut into the Spring, all the required request classes are created automatically here, right? So we have a get request, get response, and the operation which are very much required to execute the SOAP base call here, right? So this is how we are going to update the POM and generate the classes. Now next is we will create the client. Okay, so let's start creating the client. So I will simply say new class and I will say calculator client, right? I will put this class in service package and I will say finish. So the first thing is whenever you are creating the client, you just need to extend your client with web service gateway support. Okay, so I will say extends web service gateway support. I will say web service gateway support. So this is the class we required to extend for our client classes. So with the help of this, we will get all the required functionality to call the web SOAP-based web service. So in our case, we will be calling the calculator service, right? If you go here, we are going to call the calculator web service, which will be taking two integer argument and one enum, which is of type operation, right? So let's go ahead and create a method. I will say public, and of course responses, it's a get response, right? So I will say get response. I think our classes are not yet created. Let's see why it is not created. So I will simply go here and WS import. So classes are created, but those are not in a build path. So I'll simply add them as a build path. I will say use as a source folder. All right. So this is something which you need to do if your classes are giving compile time error. Okay. So this is the one thing. So get response, and I will say calculate. Okay, and I will say integer number 1 comma integer number 2 and operation, what kind of operation that we are going to perform, right? So it's operation, right? So this method will take this three argument, and we will take this three argument and call our web service, right? So I will say get request, right? Because all these three arguments are going into this object, and we will be passing this entire object to our SOAP-based web service, which we saw in our earlier tutorial, right? So I will say request is equal to new get request, and we will simply set all the details. So I will say request dot set number 1, right? I'll say number 1 request dot set number 2, yeah, number 2, right? I think dot set number 2, right? And request dot set operation. Okay, so our object is ready. Now let's call our service. So before that, we will create our response object. So I will say get response. I will say response is equal to. Now, how are we going to call our web service, right? So we already extended our class with web service gateway support. Now we have a few methods already available in this class, with the help of which we can call our web service, right? So we have get web service template method. So I will say get web service template, right? And we will marshal send and receive our response. We'll use this method, which will marshal our request and send the request and get the response back, right? So we will simply pass our web service URL. So I will go here and simply copy our web service URL, and we'll go back, and I will just put it here. So whenever you are calling or passing this web service URL, just make sure that you should not append the WSDL, right? You should remove the WSDL. It should be only till the calculator only, right? Now the next is we need to pass our actual request object, right? Which is a get request in our case, and last is a SOAP action callback. So we will create SOAP action callback, and we will pass our callback URL. So in our case, it will be qualified name, right? So I will just simply remove this. Sorry, this won't be the URL. So if you remember in our earlier session, we saw that in calculator endpoint, right? I will simply go here. In calculator endpoint, we provided a namespace with this, which is http ws into the spring developer.com, right? So this is our URL, right? And you also need to pass your local parts. So in this case, it will be a get request, right? So this way, your web service understood this request, and then it will act accordingly, right? So this web service template method returns the type of object. We just need to cast our object to our get response, right? So I will simply cast this, and the error should go, right? And then we simply return the response. Okay, so this is how we have created our calculator client. It's very simple, right? So we we created our request, then we use the web service template class, and we will pass our web service URL, and we'll also pass SOAP action callback if required, along with the request object. Then we'll get the response back. That so this is how we are going to create a client. Now next is we will see how we can call this client using command line runner, and then we will execute this web service. So before we proceed ahead to call this method, we also need to add all the configurations related to this client, right? So let's create a configuration class. So I will simply go here and I will say new class calculator config. Okay, and I will just put this in config package, right? And I will say finish. Now the first thing is, as this is the configuration, I want this class to be loaded at the runtime during our application startup, right? So let's add the annotation, which is configuration, right? So configuration, and let's create our bean. Now the first thing that we need to create here is the marshaller, right? So if you see in our calculator client, we use the method marshal send and receive, right? Which will basically marshal your request and response, right? So for that we require some default marshaller, right? So let's create a bean which will return this marshaller. So I will say bean, and I will say public. The marshaller that we are going to use is jax b2 marshaller. Okay, so I will jax b2 marshaller. Okay, this is the class, and I will say marshaller, and we will simply return this class. We'll create this, and we will also set the context part. So I will create an object of jax b2 marshaller. I will say marshaller, and I will say marshaller is equal to new marshaller, right? And I will set the path. This marshaller should know which object is he is going to marshal, right? So for that he needs all the details of the WSDL, right? From the WSDL basically. So we'll use the context path which we used earlier, right? So in the context path, basically we are going to provide all the packages name, right? So here, if you remember in our form.xml file, right, we provided the package name. So this is the package name that we will be required to add here, so that this marshaller can use the classes from this package and marshal the request and response as well, right? So now let's return this. So I will say return marshaller, right? So this is the bean method which give us a marshaller class. Now next, let's create our client related configuration. So I will say at the rate bean, I will say public calculator client. Okay, so this will be returning the calculator client, which the class which we have created, right? So I will say calculator client, and I will simply pass jax b2 marshaller. Okay, so I will say jax b2 marshaller, and I will say marshaller, the same name as what method that which we have created above, right? So let's create the configuration. So I will say calculator client, right? I will say client is equal to new calculator client, the object we have created now. Now let's set few parameters here which are required. So first is we need to set the default URI. Okay, so default URI is the web service default URL, right? So if you go here, if you remember in our earlier session, we have created the default URI, right? Which is still up to calculator WSDL, right? So this is the address which we have created, right? So this is our default URI in our case, right? And then let's add this as a default URI. Then next is we, of course, set our marshaller as well as unmarshaller, right? So I will say client.set marshaller, which is the jax b2 marshaller, and we'll use the same marshaller here to unmarshal URL, request or response, right? So this is done marshal, and let's return this client. So we'll say return client, right? So this is how the configuration we required, right? This is very simple. What we have created, we simply created one marshaller class, which is of type Jax v2 marshaller. We set the context path of our package name where we have created all the request and response object, right? And then we created the calculator client, which will create the object of calculator client, set the marshaller, unmarshaller, and default URI, and then we send it back. Now let's go ahead and create a command line runner and call our web service. So let's try to create our command line runner. I will simply go to our main class, which is Spring Consume SOAP-based web service application. And let's create one bin here. So I will say @bin, and we will create our command line runner. So I will say public command line runner, right? And I will say lookup. You can give any name, whatever name that suits. Okay. And I will pass the calculator client. Okay. And I will say calculator client. So make sure that this name should be the same what we have provided in our config class, right? So it should be a same name so that it can read the bin method. Now, next is we are going to return the command line runner, right? So simply I will use the lambda expression here. So we will return the arguments, right? Argument of type this, right? And we'll create our request here. So I will say integer number one is equal to, let's say, 2, right? Integer number 2 is equal to, let's say, 5, right? And we will create operation is equal to operation dot add. Okay, so this is our request option. Now let's use this and pass this to our client. So I will say calculator client dot calculate method, right? So let's pass all these details, and I will just simply extract the response as well. So I will say get response, and I will say response. Okay, and now simply print this response. So I will say system dot. I will put in error so that we'll get some color here, right? So print ln on, we will print this result on error string. Okay, so we'll say response is equal to the response dot get response, result dot get response, or whatever it is, right? Response dot get response. Okay, so this is the only response that we got, right? So this is how we created a command line runner who will simply run the application. So we created a one method which will be returning command line runner, and we created the parameters and pass it to calculate method of the calculator client class or object, right? And we print the response. Now let's try to run this. So we'll simply say run as Spring Boot application. Now let's see whether we are getting the response or not. So yeah, so if you see, so addition is 5 plus 2 is 7, right? Now if you simply update the operation, so I will say multiplication. Let's save this and let's run this. So it should be 10. So response is 10, right? So this is how we can consume all your web services, right? So make sure that the configuration part and the client part is up to date, and it should be correct as per your wisdom, right? So this is how we can create a very simple client application to consume your web services. So I hope you understand how to consume the SOAP-based web service and create a client for this with this very simple example. Now, all the source code which I demonstrated in this tutorial is available on my GitHub repository, and you can find the link in the description section below. If you have any question, please do add your question, queries, or feedback in the comment section and let me know. Thanks for watching. and I will see you on the next one.